It's time to let your sports opinions fly for the main event. A 7-team elimination match to decide the District 4 3A Championship. Presented to you live by PilotPointBearcats.com. This 10-week match has been sanctioned by the University of Interscholastic League. Our celebrity referee for the District 4 3A show is none other than the daytime psychology professor, Texas high school football storyteller, North Texas insider, and DFW Inside High School Sports, the most feared member of the Texas high school mafia, the one, the only, small-town Digsy, the professor,
It is week 10. We are in the nitty-gritty. It is Professor Diggs and the District 4 3A report, powered by our friends at PilotPointBearcats.com. And what an eventful week it was last week, especially considering our lead story last week with Bushland. If you did not hear and did not see, Shallowwater handed Bushland their first loss of the year, and we'll talk a little bit about that and what that means. But I think we have to get to District 4 3A stuff first, as this is the District 4 3A report, and kind of look at what happened last week. And there was a banger game in Brock in Paradise, as Brock took on Paradise, and Brock hung on very closely, winning that game 18-13. And really looking, I think one of the main stories in this game is who's not playing as opposed to who is playing, as Brock was missing several key players, including their top running back and top receiver. Both of those kids played both ways. And then Paradise was missing their top two running backs. So neither team was at full strength. I don't have much information as to why those players were missing. Was it injury? Was it discipline related? I just have no clue at this point. I did hear that Paradise is expecting both of their running backs to return for the Whitesboro game this week. No update on the Brock information, but that's obviously some key losses for Brock, as when they when you calibrate those players forward into playing both ways, it's like losing 4 players. And at the point you're losing 4 players, obviously any team is going to be impacted. I still don't think that made sense, but hopefully you got the big picture. Brock was down the equivalent of 4 players as their couple of their top offensive threats play both ways, and obviously Paradise had the same thing going on. And really digging through this game, again, it just gets down to the fact that Brock continues to make repeated mistakes. Brock got up very early, 12-0 at halftime. They had a blocked punt and a fumble in the second half, which contributed, but that did not directly lead to the drives. Paradise got really going in the second half with Austin Iglesias. That kid is just special and really the heartbeat of Paradise. A very controversial play. I even watched the Brock Sports Network to try to watch it and figure it out. But with the game 13-12, and if you're at a game on a Friday night, you know that the wind was a factor. Brock was kicking into the wind with their backup field goal kicker and a roughing, and they missed the field goal, and a roughing, which would have effectively ended the game, and a roughing the kicker flag was called. A lot of people thought that the punt of the kick might have been tipped, which would have negated that. Nothing really. It was just nothing really you could see on the video to deny or substantiate that fact. But obviously that was a big factor in Brock being able to score the next play and take the 18-13 lead and then hang on. So obviously Brock really missed their players and might have even had a fortunate occurrence. And I think must-hear audio just about every week is hearing the Brock Coach Mathis on the post-game show because he definitely does not hold back his opinion when it comes to things. And my opinion, as I continue to watch a Brock, is when are they going to get out of their own way? We are 8 games in, so we're 80% of the way through the season. Brock is 4-4. They're immensely talented, yet they still cannot stay out of their own way. When you look at Paradise played a pretty clean game. They didn't have any turnovers. They didn't have any special teams issues. They did have that penalty, which, again, is questionable at best as far as extending the drive where Brock missed the field goal. But Paradise played above their pay grade, and Brock played below their pay grade, and ultimately that led to a one-score victory that Brock was able to get and able to effectively win the district championship by winning that game against Paradise. Statistically and mathematically, theoretically, Brock could lose their last 2 games, and whichever of Paradise and Whitesboro wins out could theoretically be the number 1 seed, but as of right now, you have to kind of consider Brock the district champion if they take care of business to finish out their season. A huge game that we told you would be a high-scoring affair, and it, again, did not disappoint. The Peaster Greyhounds, with their best win in a while, defeated the Ponder Lions 55-35. That game eliminated Ponder from the mathematical contention to win or to make the playoffs. And Peaster had a great night. Tremar Gilbert was nominated for the DFW Varsity Fort Worth Star-Telegram Player of the Week with just incredible numbers. He had 16 carries for 214 yards, had a 72-yard run, and 3 touchdowns. He also had a reception for 16 yards. Gunnar McElroy had a very efficient night, 20 for 32, 184 yards, and 2 touchdowns. And ultimately, when you look at this, it boils down to turnovers, and so much of the District 4 3A turnovers is such a key. The Peaster defense was able to pick off Clifton Cooper 3 times in that game. He still had his video game numbers, 27-47 for 360 yards. He also scored a touchdown, threw for 4 touchdowns, and rushed for a touchdown, 22 for 68 in that touchdown. And just, Case Peacock, what can you say about that kid? 12 receptions for 210 yards. So we'll talk about with Pilot Point. A couple of players had some just incredible receiving nights, and 12 for 210 and 3 touchdowns, his favorite target on the night. But with Peaster defeating Ponder in pretty convincing fashion, that game was 42-20 at halftime, and then Peaster was able to hold on in the second half. Again, it just boils down to the turnovers, and Ponder had played some pretty clean games previously, but Peaster's defense was able to get some of those turnovers, and they were able to get back on the win column. They had quite the losing streak going into this game, but beating Ponder revives their playoff opportunity. Ponder is now mathematically eliminated. Another game on our docket last week was Pilot Point versus Boyd. It was Pilot Point's homecoming, and Boyd ruined their homecoming, defeating them 35-28. And again, a pretty fantastic game. Boyd was able to have a late drive in the fourth quarter to win the game, 35-28, as we mentioned. In our preview, we said that Wyatt Smith would have to have an incredible night, and he definitely did. 11 for 27, 292 yards, and 3 touchdowns. His favorite target, again, Ashton Kirby. What can you say about Ashton Kirby? I mean, he is having video game numbers. He's somebody you're going to see first team all district. Just as district has gone, he has really stepped up his game and has run after catch. In addition to catching the long balls, 8 for 235 yards, 65-yard long catch, and 3 touchdowns for Ashton Kirby. So 235 of the 292 yards went to Ashton Kirby, so obviously Wyatt Smith's favorite target. Gage Anderson had 15 carries for 66 yards. Wyatt wasn't as effective in rushing the ball, and sacks can factor into that as well. 8 carries, only 6 yards, but one of them was a touchdown. For Boyd, again, they're a very good team. They have, they don't have a high ceiling. They kind of display consistently. Braden McIntyre, 11 for 26, 2 touchdowns, 145 yards. He also had 2 turnovers. So the fact that Pilot Point won the turnover battle yet did not win the game, I think speaks to the dominance of Boyd when it came to the infrastructure of the team. And I think that's one thing that when you really dig into the stat box, you can really see that Pilot Point is struggling with depth right now. A lot of their kids are playing both ways, and Boyd has a little more depth right now, a little more players that they can throw at you on both sides of the ball, and probably a little fresher in the fourth quarter when it comes to that. Whereas Pilot Point is playing most of their kids both ways for pretty much for the entire game. Carter McClure, 23 carries for 101 yards and 3 touchdowns. Gavin Rosado, 22 carries for 113 yards. And again, that's, to me, when I didn't watch the game, but when you just look at those kind of stats, 4 or 5 yard averages, just wearing down Pilot Point in the fourth quarter. That drive looks like it was about 8-minute drive to take the lead and ultimately win the game in the fourth quarter. Just running the ball and leaning on Pilot Point. And Pilot Point is still mathematically able to make the playoffs, and we'll talk about that a little bit as we get into this week. Aiden LeMasters, 2 touchdowns for Boyd, 2 receptions for 66 yards. Both times he caught the ball, he scored. One was for 34 yards, and the other was for 32 yards. Jake Thomas, 3 receptions for 38 yards. Carter McClure out of the backfield, 5 for 32, and Gavin Rosado, 1 for 9. So when Boyd, took the shots, it was hit or miss. They had some interceptions and they had some big plays, and ultimately their depth was enough to knock out Pilot Point and put Pilot Point on life support for making the playoffs. Gage Anderson, again, another good day as far as that goes. What can you say about Wyatt Smith and Ashton Kirby for Pilot Point? They just had all world kind of games for Pilot Point. And we'll give a shout out to Crew Chandler. We talked about those 2 interceptions. Max Preps has him as having both of those interceptions. So pretty nice day for the junior out of Pilot Point on the secondary side of the ball. So Boyd defeats Pilot Point 35-28, which sets up this week's set of games and how it impacts the playoffs. We have Brock against Ponder. I don't think anybody is going to wonder about that game. I think we're just going to be talking about point spreads. And I guess we'll also be wondering if Brock gets healthy or has whatever issues that have decimated the depth of their team. If those are resolved this week, they take on Ponder. Just the matchups really do not favor Ponder. We know that Ponder has a hard time scoring against above average defenses, and I think Brock is an above average defense. This game just has one of those 63-7 kind of feels to it. Brock, I think, is just going to have their way with Ponder. But the big game of the week is Paradise versus Whitesboro. Again, it's my understanding that Paradise is going to get their running backs back, and I think that will absolutely help. I think, though, if you look at Paradise and Whitesboro, the key thing, Paradise has kept just about everybody this year to that 14 to 20 point ratio. Everybody except for our friends in Pilot Point. Pilot Point was able to score 34 points on them, and to me that tells me that when they play an above average offense that has a lot of weapons and can sling the ball around a little bit, that you can put up some points on Paradise. Brock didn't have all of their weapons, and they struggled. They only had 250 yards. Paradise had a pretty good defensive output in that game. I think Whitesboro is going to look more like Pilot Point in as far as being able to put up some points against Paradise. In fact, I think my pick on this game would be something like Whitesboro 42, Paradise 28. Paradise can certainly score points. Again, with Whitesboro's kind of had the same problem that Brock has had all year. insofar as they struggle with mistakes. They haven't played a clean game. Paradise showed, they played a state-ranked team and played a clean game. Paradise is probably one of the more consistent teams, and I think that will really serve them well when the playoffs come, that they don't seem to have mistake after mistake after mistake. They played very good football, so I think that they'll be able to compress the game a little bit and keep Whitesboro guessing with their offense. I think that Austin Iglesias will have a pretty big game. I just can't see them consistently scoring on Whitesboro, but I think Whitesboro offensively will be able to put up some numbers on Paradise. Again, can Whitesboro play a clean game? They've had 2 weeks to prepare. I'm sure just like Brock had a couple of weeks to prepare against Whitesboro, trying to clean up these turnovers, Whitesboro just needs to execute. I think Whitesboro can afford one big mistake in this game. I don't think they can afford 2 or 3 big mistakes in this game. I've got them as a 14-point favorite with one mistake in the game that impacts the score. If it starts to get to 2 or 3, then I think you could see this game becoming a one-score game, if not trending toward Paradise. So my official pick will be Whitesboro 42, Paradise 28, and I think Whitesboro will clean things up a little bit. I think Paradise will play a pretty clean game as they have all year, and that makes them one of the consistent teams. And that will be the end of the regular season for Paradise. Paradise will be have 2 weeks to look at who they will be playing in the playoffs, and we'll talk a little bit about that and who they might be playing coming up. And the big game of the week, as far as playoffs and how the playoff situation will work out, Peaster versus Pilot Point. Currently, Pilot Point's only real route into making the playoffs is getting into a 3-way tie with Boyd and Peaster. So what they would need to do is to beat Peaster this week and then hope Peaster beats Boyd next week, creating a 3-way tie all at 3-3, and then they would need to win the District 4 3A tiebreaker. Generally speaking, I don't have the tiebreakers in front of me. I'm sure somebody will let me know what they are at the end of this week, because it'll be relevant. I'm sure our friends at Pilot Point, our guy Coach Marsh will let. I have word salad issues. Coach Marsh, I got to get his name out. I can hear him telling me about Italian restaurants in Pilot Point on the website, but I can't always come up with his name. I'm sure Coach Marsh will let us know the official tie breaks and the tie scores, especially if Pilot Point is able to beat Peaster this week. We know currently that Pilot Point is -7 since they lost to Boyd by 7, so they would probably need to beat Peaster by the max, whether that's 14, 17. Every district is a little bit different as far as that goes, but they would need to have that maxed out and then hope that Peaster and Boyd has a Peaster win that doesn't ruin the point margin for them. So Pilot Point is still mathematically in, and it starts with beating Peaster. Both these teams are 2-6. Both these teams are 1-3, and both of these teams have averaged about a 12-point loss, and they are basically statistically a tie game as far as the computer goes. For me, it's about the depth. If Pilot Point cannot get some players back, able to rest in the fourth quarter, have some depth in the fourth quarter, I think Peaster is going to win this game. Obviously, Ashton Kirby and Wyatt Smith are two very special players, but I think the best player on the field will be Tremar Gilbert. And Tremar Gilbert had huge game against Ponder, and I think that he will have a huge game against Pilot Point as well. So can Pilot Point slow him down, and are they going to be able to limit his big playability? And then if they are able to limit his big playability, will their quarterback, Gunnar McElroy, be able to pick up the slack, either running the ball or finding the ball downfield? I think that'll be the storyline as far as that game goes. But again, I think that we're going to see Peaster win a 35-28 game, very similar to the Boyd game. It'll be a back and forth sort of affair. I don't think turnovers are going to be a factor in this game. I think both teams will play a relatively clean game. Obviously, we could come back and see Pilot Point has 3 turnovers, or Peaster has 3 turnovers, and I think Pilot Point could really benefit from. That's the one thing that you can deal with depth, is to cause a couple of turnovers, and that's what they might need. I think of that effort play from Wyatt Smith a couple of weeks ago against Ponder, where he was able to run down the Ponder player and get a strip right there, and that was basically a 14-point play in that moment. So Pilot Point is going to need to do something like that. Pilot Point was able to get some turnovers against Boyd. They just weren't able to take advantage of those turnovers ultimately, and I think that Pilot Point is going to need to be able to not only force the turnovers against Peaster, but take advantage of those turnovers as well. But I have Peaster winning 35-28. But if Pilot Point is able to win that game, I think at some point they'll have played with these tiebreaker scenarios, especially since Boyd is 2-3 and only has one game left, and Pilot Point will have Brock next week. Obviously, that's not something that you can expect to win to flip over the district, although if they win this week and then can win next week, then they might be able to get that spot completely on their own. I think I said all the teams would be 3-3. They would need all get to 2-4 to get to that three-way tie. Not 3-3, but 2-4 to get to the three-way tie, to where you can get Boyd, Peaster, and Pilot Point all potentially having the points tiebreaker to decide that fourth spot. Whitesboro versus Paradise will decide the second spot, and that could end up being a pretty important decision, as we will talk about as we again project the playoffs in kind of our lead story, again looking at the playoff brackets and looking at what happened last week. A little bit of the District 4 3A curse. The one thing, if you remember, I just gave this glowing review about Bushland, and the one thing I said about them compared to Brock and Whitesboro was they don't make mistakes. That Bushland had played a very clean style of football. I could only find just a handful of turnovers in doing my research. So what do they do in the first half against Shallowwater? They go -3. It's just the way that would have to go, of course, and that's pretty much the difference in that game, that they just could not overcome it. They were able to get that score to 34-28 at one point before Shallowwater scored the last 9 points to make the final 43-28. So Bushland had a furious comeback. Just wasn't enough to overcome the mistakes earlier. And again, the statistics were, very one-sided as far as Bushland had the big numbers. Dawson Jaco threw for over 400 yards, but he also had an interception, and there was 2 fumbles on the play. But one thing that Shallowwater was able to do defensively, we talked about the running threat for Bushland in Ivan Soto. He only ran for 20 for 70 yards. So Shallowwater defensively was able to limit his playmaking ability. They could not limit Dawson Jaco's playmaking ability, but what they could do was force turnovers. And for Shallowwater, since now we have to kind of keep an eye on them, since obviously they defeated Bushland, Cannon Reed ran the ball very well, 32 times. High-capacity running back, if you were carrying the ball 32 times for 189 yards. And then Brooks Carter did not throw the ball often, but when he did, it was effective. 6 of 13 for 208 yards. Trevor Wynn caught 2 for 104, and Cade Bird caught 1 for 74. So 3 pretty big pass plays, as you can see, to get a big chunk of that yards. Otherwise, Cannon Reed was the playmaker, and he was able to grind the yards out down the field. And ultimately, we now have flipped that district where Bushland is now considered the 2 seed and Shallowwater is now considered the 1 seed. And ultimately what that means is that they are now on the Brock side of the bracket as opposed to the Whitesboro and Paradise side of the bracket. So the way I see things going on is that you're going to have Denver City as your first seed in District 1 3A, and then you're going to have Shallowwater as your number 1 seed in District 2 3A. Jim Ned looks like they're going to be the number 1 seed in 3 3A, and then Brock is currently our seed in 4 3A. When you look at District 3 3A, though, which is the first round battle for our District 4 3A opponents, quite a bit is still to be determined as we've had all kinds of chaos. A lot of people thought this was going to be Breckenridge's district. and that was everything would have to go through Breckenridge. But Jim Ned said, "Oh, what about us? Don't forget about us. We're still Jim Ned. We're still the team you have to keep an eye on." And they have the toughest schedule coming up. They still have Vernon and Iowa Park to play, but they control their own destiny to win the district battle. And I think we'll have a little bit more clarity as they play Vernon this week. They're a bit of a favorite over Vernon, but if Vernon beats Jim Ned, then we might have Vernon as the top seed, Jim Ned as the second seed, and then Breckenridge as the third seed, and Iowa Park as the fourth seed, depending on how the Breckenridge and Bowie game goes. If Bowie cannot beat Breckenridge, then you pretty much have your four seeds. It's just the seeding and how that goes. But if Bowie is able to upset Breckenridge, we have a whole different ball game as far as our District 3 3A seeding goes. If Breckenridge, Vernon, and Iowa Park all end up in a three-way tie, which is a very likely scenario, there's still a lot of football to be played in District 3 3A, but Breckenridge would probably end up, all three of these teams have played each other. Breckenridge has won the positive point differential as far as that goes. So Breckenridge would likely be the second seed, Vernon would likely be the third seed, and Iowa Park would likely be the fourth seed with those three teams having played each other. So Iowa Park would end up playing Brock. Vernon would end up playing the winner of Whitesboro and Paradise. Breckenridge would play the loser of Whitesboro and Paradise, and then Jim Ned would play whichever of our teams end up in the fourth seed, whether that being Boyd, Peaster, or Pilot Point. We don't know right now, given that that is still in play, and I think we'll get a little bit of clarity this week. If Peaster is able to beat Pilot Point, then we have basically a straight-up game with Boyd and Peaster next week playing for the fourth playoff spot. But if Pilot Point does beat Peaster this week, then all bets are off. Boyd will control its own destiny, but if Peaster beats Boyd, they could potentially win by enough to win that positive points tiebreak, or depending on how Pilot Point does in their hypothetical win over Peaster, they might have enough to win the positive point tiebreak. We know Pilot Point again is -7, so they're going to have to win by a lot more than 7 to overcome that negative number to get to the point where they have a chance to win. And I'm sure, again, Coach Marsh and that crew will be calculating all those numbers, and we'll have all of that information as the fourth quarter is going, if that's something that they need. So that's a little bit of an insight into how things are going as far as that goes. And then, so if you look at the kind of how the bracket breaks down, you might have Denver City playing Whitesboro or Vernon potentially in the second round of the playoffs, and then you might have Shallowwater playing Whitesboro or Vernon in the I guess I just said Whitesboro or Vernon, Breckenridge or Paradise in the second round of the playoffs. It looks like Jim Ned and Bushland would be a second round kind of a game, and Brock would probably play the winner of Brownfield and Muleshoe. So when you look at the brackets, it definitely looks like the bottom half of the bracket, if you look at these teams, on the bottom half you have Jim Ned, Bushland, Brock, and potentially Brownfield or Muleshoe, whereas on the top half of the bracket, you have Denver City, Shallowwater, and then the Whitesboro, Paradise, Vernon, Breckenridge, whoever is able to get out of that. So the way the things are moving, you might definitely see Whitesboro or Paradise, depending on how that game goes and who establishes itself as the second seed, has a really good chance to make it to the regional final. And I think they have the easier road with a surging Jim Ned, an angry Bushland, who may not have 3 turnovers again in the playoffs or any time this season, a Brock team that's quite the enigma, and then Brownfield or Muleshoe. Brownfield's going to have a very nice record. Will probably end up 8-2, but having that loss to Denver City will hurt them. And then Muleshoe is obviously always a dangerous team. So Brock is a very beatable team, as we know, and if they have the wrong kind of turnover game against any of those kinds of teams, you just never know. So definitely things are interesting, and you know what? We may come back next week and it all changes with a couple of upsets. Bowie is playing pretty good football right now, so if Bowie can knock off Breckenridge, you never know. So that is the District 4 3A report. Next week we will really delve into the finals and we'll help get you ready for the playoffs here on the District 4 3A report. Chance, let them know what Ric Flair has to say about where I'm going, how I'm heading.
I ain't leaving!